Imagine waking up one morning, and your country no longer exists. Not because of a natural disaster. Not because of a bomb. But because powerful men in faraway rooms changed the lines on a map. One stroke of a pen, and everything you once called home becomes foreign land. Your hometown has a new name. The signs are written in another language. Your neighbors are gone, moved, deported, or buried. The uniform at your school has changed. Your father doesn't speak at dinner anymore, and your mother cries at night when she thinks you're asleep. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real life for millions of people after World War II. The war ended in 1945. Fireworks exploded. Flags waved. Newspapers screamed "Victory" in bold letters. But for many, the worst part of their lives had just begun. Because when the dust settled and the soldiers went home, the world they returned to was no longer the one they'd left behind. The ground had shifted. Not in a metaphorical way. In a literal way. Whole countries were moved. Borders were redrawn like a child scribbling on a globe. Identities were erased. Cultures were forced to change. The pain didn't end when the war stopped, it just changed form. Take Poland. Before the war, Poland was nestled between Germany and the Soviet Union. But after the war? It was shoved west. Not metaphorically, geographically. The Soviets took the eastern half and absorbed it into their empire. In return, the Allies handed Poland German territory in the west, land that had been German for generations. Imagine that. Imagine being Polish, told to leave the land your family had lived on for centuries because it now belongs to someone else. Or imagine being a German family, waking up in a village that suddenly isn't part of Germany anymore, and being told to leave everything behind. Over 12 million Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe after the war. From places like East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, the Sudetenland. Men, women, and children walked for miles in the dead of winter. No trains, no buses. Just feet blistering on frozen ground. Many starved. Many froze. Some were beaten. Some were shot. Many were never seen again. This was not the Nazis being punished. These were civilians. Farmers. Mothers. Children. They weren't part of the decisions made at the Yalta Conference or the Potsdam Conference, where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin sat in elegant rooms and decided the fate of millions with cigars in their hands and whiskey on the table. The people who actually had to live with those decisions had no voice, no seat at the table. The lines were redrawn without mercy. And it wasn't just Germany and Poland. Czechoslovakia expelled nearly 3 million ethnic Germans after the war. They were forced out in waves, many under brutal conditions. And here's the dark truth, the Allied powers, yes, even the democratic West, approved it. They called it population transfer. It was supposed to prevent future wars. But it was, in many ways, its own kind of violence. Imagine being a child, 5, maybe 6 years old, sitting in the back of a wagon, watching your village disappear behind you. Your father's tools left behind. Your mother's wedding dress stuffed in a sack. The graves of your grandparents abandoned. And no one tells you where you're going. Just that you can't stay. Now imagine the people moving into those homes, new families, speaking a different language, sleeping in the same bed your grandmother died in. How do you build peace on top of that? But not all of the trauma was about geography. Some of it was about identity. About suddenly being labeled something you never chose to be. Take Korea. Before World War II, Korea had been a single, unified country for over 1,000 years. But when Japan surrendered, the Allies divided Korea down the 38th parallel, north for the Soviets, south for the Americans. It was supposed to be temporary. Just until things settled down. But the Cold War didn't allow that. 2 Koreas were born, each claiming to be the true Korea. And within 5 years, they would be at war. Families torn apart by ideology, by fear, by a line on a map that hadn't existed before 1945. And even now, that border remains one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The Korean War never technically ended. And it all began with decisions made in rooms where no Korean was present. Imagine waking up and realizing that your brother now lives in another country. That sending him a letter is illegal. That calling him is impossible. That the only way to see him again is through a fence with guns pointed at you. What kind of peace is that? And what about the Jews? The Holocaust ended, yes. But for the survivors, the nightmare didn't stop with liberation. Many had no homes to return to. Entire families were gone. Their towns had been burned or repopulated. In some places, those who survived the camps returned, only to be attacked again. In Poland, for example, the Kielce pogrom of 1946 saw a mob murder dozens of Holocaust survivors, after the war had ended. Why? Because of a rumor. A lie. A leftover of Nazi poison. This fear, this rootlessness, led many Jews to flee Europe altogether. Thousands went to British-controlled Palestine, where tensions were already boiling. And by 1948, a new war was underway, this time over the birth of Israel. Once again, people were displaced. Once again, identities were clashing. Once again, the war's end was just the beginning. Even in Western Europe, things were not simple. France purged its collaborators, some fairly, many not. Women accused of sleeping with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public, paraded through the streets in shame. Justice? Maybe. Revenge? Certainly. But it shows that even victory didn't bring purity. Just more complexity. In the Balkans, entire ethnic groups were labeled enemies and hunted down. Tito's Yugoslavia executed thousands suspected of being on the wrong side. In Greece, a civil war erupted between royalists and communists, leaving scars that still shape the country today. Peace after World War II didn't look like a dove. It looked like barbed wire, refugee trains, burned records, lost names. The media painted victory as clean. But the truth was messy, bloody, human. The maps in schoolbooks didn't show the trails of people walking through snow. They didn't show the crying children left behind. They didn't show the thousands of personal tragedies hidden behind statistics. If this story makes you feel something, anything, then you're in the right place. Because we don't tell history the way they do in textbooks. We tell it the way it felt. The way it broke hearts. The way it shaped the present. So if you want more forgotten stories, if you want to understand not just what happened, but how it felt to live through it, then subscribe. Because this was just the beginning. They said the war was over. But for millions of people, the chaos was only beginning. No more gunfire, no more air raids, but now came something even more confusing: silence. Emptiness. And decisions made without them. In that silence, entire lives were rewritten. Not by choice, but by force. Let's leave Europe for a moment and look at Japan. Once a fearsome empire, ruling over Korea, China, and parts of Southeast Asia, its power vanished almost overnight. In August 1945, after 2 atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. And for the first time in its long history, it was no longer ruled by its own people. Instead, it was governed by the Americans. The U.S. military, led by General Douglas MacArthur, became the face of authority. Japanese officials were told what laws to make, what to remove, how to reshape their entire society. The emperor, once worshipped like a living god, was forced to step forward and speak on the radio, in a human voice. And what he said shocked the nation. He admitted he was not divine. For millions of Japanese citizens, that moment shattered everything they believed. It wasn't just the bombs. It wasn't just the defeat. It was the crumbling of identity. A cultural collapse. Imagine growing up thinking your emperor was descended from the gods, and then hearing him speak like a man. Tired. Sorrowful. Broken. It was like being told gravity no longer worked. At the same time, Japan's military was dismantled. Its constitution rewritten. The entire empire dissolved. Taiwan was returned to China. Korea, no longer a colony, was divided in two. And across the Pacific, a different kind of war was already beginning. The Cold War. This wasn't a war with trenches and tanks. It was fought in shadows. With maps, spies, and ideology. And it would shape the world in ways World War II never could. Back in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was rising like a giant out of the ashes. Stalin had marched his Red Army all the way to Berlin. And when the Nazis fell, the Soviets didn't leave. They stayed. In Poland. Hungary. Romania. Bulgaria. East Germany. They called it liberation. But to many, it felt like one occupation had been traded for another. Governments were overthrown. New regimes were installed, loyal to Moscow. Dissent was crushed. Newspapers were silenced. Churches were watched. People disappeared. One moment, you're teaching history in a school. The next, you're labeled a traitor, for owning the wrong book or having the wrong opinion. That was the birth of the Eastern Bloc. And right in the heart of it all, Berlin was split in half. West Berlin became a western island inside Soviet territory. Roads were blocked. Supplies were cut off. The West responded with the Berlin airlift, planes dropping food and medicine every day for nearly a year. It was a quiet battle, but a deadly serious one. Because this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about systems. Capitalism versus communism. Freedom versus control. The West versus the East. And trapped in the middle were the people. Not soldiers. Not politicians. Just ordinary people trying to live through a world that no longer made sense. Some tried to escape. From East Germany. From Hungary. From Czechoslovakia. But escape wasn't easy. Especially after walls went up. Borders lined with guards. Watchtowers. Searchlights. Dogs. Can you imagine that? Trying to cross a river at night, knowing a single wrong move could mean death. Trying to carry your baby in your coat so she doesn't cry. Hoping the sound of the wind hides your footsteps. People were desperate. Because life behind the Iron Curtain wasn't just controlled, it was engineered. Your job, your apartment, your education, all decided for you. Surveillance was constant. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Children were told to report their own parents if they spoke against the government. And still, people resisted. Quietly. Secretly. Through poems. Through prayers. Through smuggled music and whispered dreams. And while this new world was being carved out in Europe and Asia, far away, in a small land scarred by centuries of struggle, a new nation was about to be born. Israel. After the horrors of the Holocaust, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors had no place to go. They didn't want to return to towns where their families had been murdered. They didn't trust the countries that had looked away. So many fled to British-controlled Palestine, hoping to rebuild their lives in a land they believed was promised. But it wasn't empty. It was already home to Palestinian Arabs, many of whom had lived there for generations. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition the land, one state for Jews, one for Arabs. But the Arab world rejected the plan. When Israel declared independence in 1948, war broke out immediately. And once again, borders were redrawn. Families were displaced. Cities were bombed. Villages vanished. More than 700,000 Palestinians became refugees almost overnight. Their homes taken. Their lands lost. Their stories silenced. The Jewish people, rising from the ashes of genocide, now found themselves locked in a new conflict, one that still burns today. It's one of history's most painful ironies. Two peoples, both scarred by loss, both claiming the same land, both fighting for survival, in a world shaped by decisions made far away, in offices where no one knew their names. And while that war raged in the Middle East, another wound was festering in South Asia. In 1947, the British finally left India. But instead of one nation, they left two, India and Pakistan. Lines were drawn by a British lawyer who had never even been to the region before. And in just a few weeks, the largest mass migration in human history began. Over 15 million people were forced to move. Muslims to Pakistan. Hindus and Sikhs to India. But this wasn't peaceful. Trains full of bodies arrived at stations. Villages were burned. Women were assaulted. Children went missing. Nearly 2 million people died in the chaos. Some were killed by mobs. Others starved on the road. Families were torn apart forever. Imagine leaving your home with nothing but the clothes on your back, only to see your wife pulled from your arms, your father stabbed in the street. That's what peace looked like for them. And these are just a few of the places reshaped by World War II. We could talk about China, where a civil war raged between communists and nationalists. Or Vietnam, where French colonizers tried to return but faced a bloody resistance. Or Africa, where colonial powers clung to control, but rebellion was brewing. The truth is, the world didn't heal after World War II. It changed. It cracked. And in those cracks, new nations were born. New enemies rose. New tragedies unfolded. Because when the war ended, the damage wasn't over. It had just taken a new shape, quiet, cold, and hidden behind the illusion of victory. If you're still watching, still feeling this, then this is your place. This is where we don't just memorize history. We feel it. We trace the fault lines they tried to cover up. So if this journey moved you, even a little, subscribe to this channel. Because there are more stories the textbooks skipped. More truths buried in the shadows. And we are just getting started. Some wounds are invisible. No explosions. No blood. Just a quiet, aching silence that follows you for life. That's what the aftermath of World War II felt like for millions. It wasn't just about destroyed cities or collapsed governments. It was about being trapped in a world that had changed its rules, and never told you. For some, the war ended with a handshake. For others, it ended with exile. Let's return to Germany, a country broken into 4 parts, each controlled by a different allied power, the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. At first, this was supposed to be temporary. But nothing in post-war Europe was ever really temporary. The Soviet-controlled Eastern Zone grew darker, colder, more tightly controlled. Stalin wanted a communist Germany, obedient and isolated. The Western Allies wanted the opposite, a free, democratic state. 2 visions. 1 country. No middle ground. In 1949, it became official, Germany split in 2. West Germany, Federal Republic of Germany, aligned with the West. East Germany, German Democratic Republic, a Soviet satellite. And right in the middle sat Berlin, a divided city trapped inside East Germany. 1 part free. 1 part chained. People fled from east to west in droves. Teachers, doctors, artists, families. The East responded by building a wall. Not just any wall. The Berlin Wall. Concrete, steel, watchtowers. Guards ordered to shoot on sight. And overnight, a city became a prison. Imagine waking up to find your street now ends at a wall. That your cousin, who lived across town, is unreachable forever. That your wedding is cancelled because your fiancé is trapped on the other side. That your job, your dreams, your life are now divided by bricks. That's what borders do. Not just to countries, but to people. But not all the dividing lines were made of concrete. Some were drawn in the heart. Let's travel east now, to the Soviet Union itself. After World War II, the USSR had expanded its reach across half of Europe. Stalin was hailed as a hero by many Russians. After all, they'd suffered the most, over 20 million Soviet lives lost. Entire cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad left in rubble. Every family touched by grief. But what happened next was not healing. It was fear. Stalin launched brutal purges, again. Veterans who had survived the war were suddenly labeled suspicious. Ethnic minorities were deported en masse. Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Volga Germans, whole communities were loaded onto trains and sent to the frozen wilderness of Siberia or Kazakhstan. Not because of what they did, but because of who they were. Even war heroes weren't safe. If you'd seen the West, you might be corrupted. If you'd fought bravely and returned with confidence, you might be a threat. So many were arrested, sent to gulags, tortured, forgotten. The war was over. But Stalin's war on his own people had just begun. And while the East was suffocating under surveillance and fear, the West had its own scars to hide. Let's go back to France. Liberation in 1944 was triumphant. Crowds cheered. Flags waved. But underneath the celebration, a quiet fury burned. Not at the Germans, but at their own. The collaborators. French men and women who had worked with, supported, or even simply tolerated the Nazi regime. Some had profited. Some had joined the Vichy government. Some had turned in neighbors. Revenge came swiftly. People were executed in the streets, without trial. Women accused of relationships with German soldiers were dragged out, beaten, and had their heads shaved. They were paraded through towns as crowds spat and screamed. Some were only teenagers. Some had been assaulted themselves. But in the eyes of the public, mercy was weakness. And so, peace looked like punishment. The same thing happened in Italy. In the Netherlands. Even in Yugoslavia, where post-war retribution turned into mass executions and purges. Justice was messy. And in some places, it wasn't justice at all. Now shift again, this time to a place you won't find in most history books. The Baltic states. Latvia. Lithuania. Estonia. They were independent countries before the war. But in 1940, Stalin invaded. Then Hitler came. Then Stalin came back. And when the war ended? They were gone, swallowed by the USSR. The West didn't fight it. It was a sacrifice made for peace with Stalin. But the people living there? They didn't forget. Soviet rule meant forced collectivization. Secret police. Mass deportations to Siberia. Families were taken in the middle of the night, accused of being enemies of the people, and never returned. In just 1 week in 1949, the Soviets deported over 90,000 people from the Baltics. Farmers, children, elders, packed into cattle cars and dropped into the freezing taiga. Can you imagine that? Being 8 years old, clutching your mother's coat, watching snow fall through the cracks in a wooden boxcar, and not knowing where you're going or why. These are the stories that were buried under the flags of victory. Now jump again, across the Atlantic. The United States. They didn't lose cities. They didn't suffer occupation. But the war changed America forever. Factories had boomed. Women had worked. African Americans had fought overseas, hoping their service would earn them respect at home. Instead, they came back to segregation. To whites-only signs. To being told to go to the back of the bus, even after fighting fascism. It was one of the great contradictions of the post-war world, liberty abroad, inequality at home. But something had started. The civil rights movement was no longer a whisper. It was growing louder. Stronger. Because people who had stared death in the face overseas refused to be silent at home. And here's one last shift to think about. Children. Born after the war. Called the boomers. They never saw the blood. Never smelled the smoke. But they inherited everything the war left behind. The borders. The politics. The nuclear fear. The unresolved conflicts. They grew up with duck and cover drills in schools. With maps that showed the world as two sides, us and them. With a Cold War that loomed like a ghost over their futures. They were told their world was at peace. But it didn't feel like peace. Because World War II didn't just end with silence. It ended with walls. With partitions. With scars too deep for words. This is what history usually skips. Not the dates. Not the names. But the feeling. The broken families. The homes lost. The languages erased. The memories that faded because no one wanted to remember. But we remember here. If this shook something in you, if it made you see history not just as facts, but as people, then stay with us. And it's time we talk about how the past never truly ended. It just lives on, in ways we never expected. There's something no one tells you about history. It doesn't stay in the past. It echoes. It lingers. It seeps into the cracks of the present, shaping everything around us, our borders, our fears, our politics, even our names. The war ended. That much is true. But what came after, kept changing the world in ways we still haven't fully understood. Let's go somewhere quiet. Austria. It had been part of the Third Reich, Hitler's homeland. After the war, Austria was divided just like Germany. 4 zones. 4 occupiers. But the difference was, Austria escaped permanent division. Why? Because in 1955, a deal was made. The Soviets would leave if Austria promised to stay neutral. No NATO. No Warsaw Pact. It worked. Austria became a bridge between East and West. A country spared from the Cold War split. Now compare that with Hungary. 10 years after the war ended, its people rose up. Students and workers flooded the streets, demanding freedom from Soviet control. For a moment, it seemed possible. The government crumbled. Statues of Stalin were torn down. People danced in the streets. And then the tanks came. Soviet forces rolled in. Thousands were killed. Tens of thousands were arrested. Over 200,000 fled the country. Some made it out. Others never did. The message was clear: you can't rewrite the story we've given you. And it wasn't just Hungary. It happened again in Czechoslovakia in 1968. It happened in Poland in the 1980s. Each time, people tried to breathe. And each time, someone tightened the grip. But the cracks were spreading. Not just in Europe. Across the ocean, a new kind of war had begun. It wasn't fought with tanks. It was fought with threats. Propaganda. Missiles that never launched, but could end the world if they did. The Cold War wasn't cold for everyone. In Vietnam, the shadow of World War II shaped everything. Japan had occupied Vietnam during the war. When Japan surrendered, the Vietnamese declared independence. But France came back, trying to reclaim its colony. That led to war. A war that spiraled into something far bigger. The United States joined in. So did China. So did the Soviets. And suddenly, this small Southeast Asian country became the front line of a global ideological war. Millions died. And when the dust cleared, Vietnam was united under communist rule, but the land, the people, the future, were scarred forever. The same story played out in Korea. Remember the line, the 38th parallel? That line turned into a war that never ended. North and South. Families ripped apart. Bombs dropped. Soldiers frozen in trenches. To this day, that border is one of the most militarized places on Earth. And it all began from the ashes of a war that supposedly ended in peace. But let's look even further away. To Africa. World War II had shaken the colonial system. Europe was weakened. The old empires couldn't hold on forever. And across Africa, people began demanding what had been denied for centuries: independence. One by one, nations broke free. Ghana. Algeria. Kenya. Angola. Zimbabwe. But the legacy of colonialism, those artificial borders drawn by European rulers, left behind deep fractures. Rival tribes forced into one country. Natural resources stolen. Leaders propped up, then abandoned. In Rwanda, decades later, it would all explode. In Nigeria, it led to civil war. In Congo, to decades of violence. The war might have ended in 1945, but the consequences rippled outward, like cracks in glass. Quiet at first. Then shattering. In the Middle East, the chain reaction never stopped. After the formation of Israel, wave after wave of wars followed. 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973. The refugee crisis grew. Palestinian displacement deepened. And tensions spread across neighboring countries: Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria. It wasn't just a regional conflict. It became a global one. With Cold War powers funding opposite sides. With arms pouring in. With lives being traded for influence. And behind every border drawn, was a ghost. A family that used to live there. A child buried under rubble. A name scratched into a wall. But not all consequences were violent. Some were quieter. Hidden in laws, in ideas, in memory. In Germany, the guilt of what had happened during the war became part of the national identity. Monuments were built. Apologies were issued. Education systems were reformed to teach the horrors, so they would never be repeated. But elsewhere, the memory faded. In Japan, textbooks were rewritten to soften the past. Entire generations grew up not knowing what happened in Nanking, or what the Imperial Army did in Korea and China. And that silence created something dangerous. Historical amnesia. Because when memory dies, denial grows. That's how old hatred survives. That's how new wars begin. And sometimes, the most haunting part of history is what people choose to forget. But there's one more place this war never left. One more place where it continues, quietly shaping everything. Here. Right now. Look around you. The United Nations exists because of World War II. NATO exists because of World War II. The borders on your globe, the alliances between nations, the refugee crises, the rise of nuclear weapons, the fear of another world war, it all comes from what happened in those 6 years, and what came after. Even your identity may be tied to that war. Maybe your grandparents fled their homeland. Maybe your family's last name changed at Ellis Island or in a refugee camp. Maybe the city you live in today only exists because someone else was forced to leave theirs. That's how big this was. That's how deep it runs. The war ended in 1945. But the world never really went back. It moved forward, carrying everything with it. Every unburied secret. Every unspoken grief. Every line drawn in blood that still divides us today. And maybe that's why history matters, not because it's old, but because it's never truly over. If you're still here, if you've listened this far, then you know. You feel it. You understand what they never taught you in school. So stay curious. Ask more questions. And don't let anyone tell you history is just the past. Because sometimes, it's the only way to understand the present. And maybe, just maybe, stop the next line from being drawn in blood.